Okay, guys, now I'm going to show you guys how I approached rendering my landscape. Okay, so I have my completed line drawing of the reference image, right? Um, but now I'm trying to make it look more realistic by rendering it, right? So um, the first step I always do is apply that midtone, right? So in the first, there you go. So I applied the midtone. It's just a light gray across the entire thing, right? As I mentioned before, the darkest you can get is black and the lightest you can get is white. So just having a light layer of gray will apply that midtone that I said was going to take up most of the image anyway. Normally, we only have to apply a midtone to a small part of the paper, right? Because we're only using a small part of the paper for our character drawing. But since we're using the entire paper, you actually need to apply your midtone everywhere. Okay. Then since there's no visible light source and I'm using the entire paper, I didn't really want to write light on the paper because that would be potentially difficult to erase. So that's why I just kind of left it as is. Right. I start with the shadows. Remember, the right side is where all my shadows are supposed to be. Adding in some darker values to create those darker shadows as well. Right. So my main focus is actually on this mountain. Everything else in the picture is kind of like insignificant in comparison, right? Our focal point is the mountain. So I need to make sure that all those details, if you look at the reference, right, all these details with the little cracks and the like different levels and layers and turns and all these things, right? I want to make sure that I show those things. Okay, but remember what I said before in lesson 2. Because this is such an abstract object, uh, I don't really need to make sure that it's 100% correct. I'm just kind of using the reference at this point as a guide, right? So let's keep going. I added underneath here the shadow because, like I said, underneath this plane is supposed to be in shadow as well because the light's over here. Um, and then it was really quick, but let me see if I can find it. It was really quick, but I was able to add a few shadows and darken up this mid-tone area just a slight bit to show the different like rock formations on the side of this mountain, right? If I just left it blank like this, it looks a lot flatter, right? This side of the mountain, the left side of the mountain ends up looking flatter. All right, so that's why I added in those little shadows to create those like different layers. Um, and then I finish up these rocks on the bottom as well, following the same principle of light source as I mentioned before, right? Underneath the rocks should have the shadow, and it should be slightly more to the right, right? And then everything on the top left over here, that is going to be in highlight. All right. So here, I actually start to add in the shadows of the clouds, right? The clouds have a darker bottom part, right? And those shadows should follow the shape of the cloud, right? You have to use soft shadows, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, soft shadows to make the clouds look fluffier, to look softer. If you just use hard shadows, excuse me, then your clouds don't end up looking very cloud-like, right? Oh, sorry. So um, notice that with the eraser, I only added a few highlights towards the tops of the clouds, right? I wanted to leave this kind of darker to make sure that you could differentiate between the clouds and the mountain, okay? So I took the eraser, let me bring it back, just on a few little places in the clouds, a few spots in the mountain, but that's it, okay? I added some shadow down here to create like a hill that looks like it's rolling a bit. I added some shadow underneath the trees as well, right? The bottom of the trees. Notice that these, I'm gonna zoom in a bit. Notice that these trees, the shapes, kind of resemble these clouds, right? And um, in order to make them look different, I use different types of shading, right? This is a hard shadow, right here. There's a hard shadow in the leaves to make them look like the leaves are more rigid. And I used a soft shadow here to make them look softer, right? Remember, different textures can help your viewer differentiate between the different parts. If I just use hard shadows here, it might look like there are trees just like floating in the sky. Or if I use soft shadows here, it could look like there are clouds at the bottom rather than trees. Okay, so let's bring it back, and there you go. Right, once I finished adding shadows to everything, done deal, and I'm done.